they're looking at that cost and not understanding that those items might not be something we can reprocess. So are they really saving in the end because we're refusing to process those items and giving that education as to why? Where if we were the ones purchasing from SPD, we would have that knowledge and insight into not purchasing something that's lower grade that over time is going to end up costing more anyway.
Rising above the ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for people, processes and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Angela Benson, Sterile Processing Education Specialist at UW Health. And Hank, today we're going to be talking about tracking clinic instruments and the communication that comes with that, the documentation, all the challenges around making sure that you're in alignment. And what about those instruments? Hey, wait a second. That's not what I sent over to you to reprocess. We're going to get into it today.
Yes, we scan, Justin. Yes, we scan. We're going to get into scanning. But I'm going to ask some questions about the breakdowns in scanning, because that's just an issue that I know I've had in the past in supporting clinics in our facilities, and something tells me that I'm not alone. And we know that this is a topic that has come up for years in our industry, and I seriously just don't think the majority of our hospital leadership understand how challenging onboarding all these clinics over time can be and the impact that it has, especially, and we talked about this in a recent total tracking conference, especially if your unit of service and your productivity measurement is not counting for clinic volume. If you're being measured on operating room volume, and that's the staffing they're giving you to support OR cases, but you're onboarding 20, 30, 40 clinics, that's massive. That's like 1, 2, 3 FTEs to support all that clinic volume, and it's just not even showing up. So I don't know if we'll have time to get to all of that in this conversation, but we're going to start the conversation around clinics and hopefully spark more of that conversation across the industry.
Yeah, great point about the clinics and how the productivity is measured, Hank. All right, everybody, we're going to be right back after a short break with Angela Benson. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Angela Benson, Sterile Processing Education Specialist at UW Health. And Angela, very excited to have you on to talk about tracking clinic instruments. And I can tell you there's a lot of people out there that when all of a sudden, if they haven't done it before and they get told they're going to do it, there's quite a reaction to that. So we're going to talk about how to be successful with it today. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'm pretty excited to talk about this subject.
So, Angela, I know you've participated in other conferences and virtual events here at Beyond Clean, but can you talk about your background kind of leading up through becoming the Sterile Processing Education Specialist today?
Sure. I actually was in sterile processing many years ago as a teenager, and so I first got introduced to sterile processing. It was a program that they no way have in current times, as it was a volunteer basis, and I was quite young. That's what got me in the interest of doing sterile processing. And I then, 11 years later, after having another career, decided that I wanted to do something different and get back into sterile processing. So when I started my job in 2015 at UW Health, I came in as a Tech 1, got certified through HSPA and became Tech 2 shortly after that. Then I was able to have the opportunity to become a senior technician And then I would say 2 years into that role, I was a part of a lot of the onboarding and training for new staff on our second shift. And as we had a role already in place for educator, that position became vacant. And it was an opportunity to be able to go for it. I held myself back for my many excuses and reasons not to get into it. Fear and change and all the unknown and responsibilities. We actually were able to fill that role back again with the same person, but it wasn't very long after that. He actually then went on to other things. And I, with my encouragement of my manager, applied for the position and got it, and have been in that role for 3 years actually this month. And I have absolutely loved it since then because of that initial introduction to it when I was in my teens and having that excitement and interest in it and not actually getting a chance to do it full time then, and kind of that unknown and that what if I had done it and continued on. I've been able to apply that passion and desire and learning new things from then to now and being able to share that with new employees coming in who have backgrounds with not any sterile processing experience. So that's how I've gotten to the role I'm in now.
And so now you're in this role and we're bringing you on to talk about clinics. So how does managing the clinics and supporting them and, tracking their instruments, which can be a challenge, how does that fit into your role today?
I believe I got involved in this process right around the time that I started my educator role. It was a discussion that was happening with leadership and key stakeholders. I just gotten kind of just a little bit of the conversation. My manager was talking a little bit about this process that's going to be happening. We had offsite clinics through UW Health that were needing to centralize. And I started just doing my thing that I do with 1,000 thoughts and just coming out of my mouth, just nonstop of all the questions and then being involved, which then led me into being invited into the conversation. And that's just where it took off, where I just kind of put myself out there. And we have another role in our organization, which is sterile processing coordinator. And his responsibility is those clinics, but we have such a variety and a large amount of them that he was part of the conversation. And just for his location for the university hospital and then for our hospital, I just kind of took on that role to be able to be the direct person that those clinics we took to our facility to have that point person.
At your facility, Angela, I know this is going to vary, right, for like all the audience who's tuning in. Like everyone's going to have a different connection with clinics and different numbers, but just kind of for some context, about how many clinics is your department supporting today?
We are supporting offsite 20 clinics. I would say on-site, I can't forget about those 5 to 6, I believe, on-site, where I think considering some of the practices that we're doing are very similar, whether that's off-site or on-site as well. So yeah. Around 20.
It's a great distinction. I don't know if I planned on asking you that question or not, but that is an interesting point because we kind of view our primary customer in sterile processing as the operating room. Maybe we include ER in that, if it's a high volume ER, but then outside of that, oftentimes everybody else, like we just call clinic, respiratory, wound care, etc. But yeah, those numbers, like I really want, if any administrators are listening to this episode, I want you to be shocked by how many clinics our departments are supporting. Because I think a lot of these folks, as you get up into the C-suite, have no idea. Like they think, okay, this is a department that's supporting our facility and our surgery. And they just act like we've got an unlimited bandwidth to just, oh yeah, we got a new clinic coming online. Send it to sterile processing. They'll take care of it. And then here you are with 20 external clinics and all the logistics we're going to talk about, the ins and outs of that and all the purchasing, all the decisions, plus all those internal clinics that you mentioned. I mean, that is just that's shocking to me to hear. And I know there's folks tuning in who's like, oh yeah, 20? We got like 50, 60, 70. It's crazy. Anyways, so...
And that's just for the facility that in the building we're in right now. We also have then, like I stated, the university hospital and the other supporting areas. So yeah, we probably are closer to that higher amount that you just mentioned.
Yeah, massive. So let's start with just communication. How do you even approach that topic and that challenge of communicating with all of these outside entities that are, somehow connected, but oftentimes not as connected, maybe like by the name or even by the same departments, or definitely not the same reporting structures? Like, how do you even begin that communication process?
It's been quite the road to that, and it still is not where it should be. Communication really with email. A lot of that is a great receipt for when issues happen and when you, or if you have replied and taken care of it, what's the follow-up? Did you close the loop? There are other forms, and this is another layer as you start picking away at who you're communicating with. You will have the system for us, the request forms in a paper form, where you're going to have notes that are written down by MAs or end users, just whether it's detailed or not, trying to communicate something to you, and trying to handle how to respond back to that. I find that also trying to keep track of who is the leadership at these locations. The turnover rate is high. So you may have your point people where it's your manager and supervisor at that location and maybe a few of the MAs, and then they leave or they transfer, and you're trying to keep track. And there isn't really a good set way until you reach out by email and you are saying, hey, this is my issue. And they come back, oh, that's not me anymore. Maybe you can get in contact with this person. They're just kind of covering until the next person comes along. So there's a lot of that jumping around as well, which is quite the challenge. So just being diligent with that communication and trying to keep your contacts list as up to date as possible. Reaching out to someone saying, hey, this might not be you, but can you get me in touch with the right person? I find that phone calls are great as well if you have that right, like I said, contact, but you don't always have, again, that receipt of that conversation. I try to take notes as I'm discussing the issues. There's also, like I mentioned, the sterile processing coordinator, trying to communicate with him as well to keep him in the loop, because maybe we're talking about two different locations where a manager is overseeing West Side Clinic, East Side Clinic. Where are their items going to? Oh, East Side Clinic items are going over to us, but West Side's going over to another sterile processing department within our network. So just keeping track of all of that, the best you can. And with that, it would mostly be, all those forms I just said.
Yeah.
Written, email, phone calls.
I think that big takeaway that you mentioned with the receipt is huge. Even if you do have a phone call, to follow up that with an email and say, thank you for your call today. We discussed and this is the understanding, and this is the contact on our side, and this contact on your side. And then to your point, now you've got a written record that if anything happens, which inevitably it does, now you can at least go back and say everybody was on the same page at this point. So I think that's a very helpful insight there. And you mentioned the clinic turnover, which is huge. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you use technology and the tracking system to track internally, but then we'll kind of get into some of the gaps, because outside of that, I'm assuming 99.9, if not 100% of your clinics are not using a tracking system on their end. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So good guess on my part. Educated guess,
yes.
But a guess nonetheless. So another big issue is ownership. This comes up all the time when you're onboarding clinics, or if you are like transitioning in that stage, you say, like, you got a new leader, or if something happens, like something gets lost or something gets broken, the next question is, well, who owns that? So how do you approach that question at your facility, or how do you kind of work through that?
Easy answer would be the clinics themselves are the owners of those instrumentation. As we were developing the centralization of this, a lot of that instrumentation already has been purchased. But when this centralizing happened, there was a lot of discussion of the need for purchasing more to be able to support the turnaround time frame of when those instruments come to us and when we're returning them. So that is the clinic's responsibility. There have been times with what you mentioned, whether it's lost or broken and who's responsible. That's always very murky. And with good communication and discussion and trying to figure out potentially what the issue was, that leads into maybe the responsibility of whether we're purchasing a replacement for them based on maybe a fault of our own, whether we lost it truly, or if it truly was broken on our end. You have the ophthalmology items that are very delicate. You drop one of those forceps just right and you bend the tip, things like that, and just being accountable for that. Most of the time, the clinic does end up taking that responsibility and replacing those items in our case.
Yeah, that's where that whole conflict can come into play, right? Because you just described it. There's a fairly clear understanding of who's responsible for what, but sometimes there's a little bit of a conversation to determine that. And each department has to manage the budget. What do you think are the pros and cons to each side of that? Like, and maybe we start with, if you were to centralize ownership of the purchasing and replacements, et cetera, of the instruments with sterile processing, what are the pros and cons there? And then we can go to the other side of the coin.
I think that the pros would be where it'd be clean cut. We see a damaged item because we are the experts in that field as we're visualizing the way it cuts. If it's a scissor or the functionality of an item, we can better troubleshoot that immediately. And the con to the clinic, I suppose, owning it would be that we have to get that clearance through them as well. Like, just here's our opinion. We're sending it to you, but this is our recommendation, and hoping that that is taken into account, because a lot of the times with the clinic being the ones responsible to purchase the items, we've also found that the quality of the instruments is reduced, where the misunderstanding of Pakistan or, let's say, office grade instrumentation versus surgical instrumentation comes into play. That is a very big misunderstanding, and they're looking at that cost and not understanding that those items might not be something we can reprocess. So are they really saving in the end because we're refusing to process those items, and giving that education as to why? Where if we were the ones purchasing from SPD, we would have that knowledge and insight into not purchasing something that's lower grade that over time is going to end up costing more anyway.
Yeah, or is just completely non-compliant and should only be used one time to begin with. So yeah, your point about sterile processing being the experts, the instrument experts, like that is, everybody out there listening is going to be like, yep, that's true. And then I think we've all experienced, that quality point of, if there's not one person, this is true even for like your operating room. If you have different service lines and all the service line coordinators are kind of like making their own decision for instruments they want, and it causes all this complexity. And so like everyone's got their own instrument catalog and their own favorite manufacturer. And then you end up with like 20 million different variations. And yeah, it's that whole spectrum of like very expensive needle holders to like the cheapest ones because they just weren't thinking about that standard model. But yeah, then you get out to these clinics and there's even less understanding around many of these instrumentations. And so they're just at the complete whim of the salespeople they happen to run into, or conference or catalog they see. And then it all ends up in sterile processing. And we have to say, hey, like, is there a count sheet for this? I want to talk about that piece real quick. Like, do y'all use count sheets in the clinic reprocessing phase? And if not, how do you keep track of what goes and what shouldn't go to each clinic?
Yes, count sheets are used for sets or trays, whatever word you want to use. Do they understand what that is? Not all the time, no. We found that through issues with things missing. There have been times I've referenced that count sheet referring to it, and that's something we've learned, that the end user didn't understand this. They do not have a tracking system. They don't understand what is this piece of paper with descriptions of things that they don't call it that name. So we do use a count sheet for our SPD techs to verify what they're wanting in that tray is being met, whether or not that name is the matchup. So we've also have reduced sending that physical count sheet with trays unless something is missing, where then we can generate a missing label with the item description on it. Before the count sheet system and what we kind of took over, clinics were doing some of their own reprocessing. Actually, most of the clinics were doing their own reprocessing, but we had gained some binders that had information in it that was just a Word document written out what they liked. Don't care if it's straight, don't care if it's curved, just write out exactly what they need, just as these are the 5 instruments, just kind of some vague names. And so I took those and then incorporated into our tracking system to create that count sheet for sets. So yes, it's more for our use in this than their use.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And so you're saying that at least for the majority of your clinics, you'll bring in the instruments, you'll get them decontaminated, and then once they get to the clean side, that's kind of when that tracking function begins, and you'll pull up the electronic count sheet and go through the process for assembly. Okay.
Yes, because those trays were capable to place a barcode onto. So that is where we can generate that count sheet for those trays. So at least it gives us a little help to start off, because when you're looking at a bin full of instruments, you're just like, where do I begin? Do they want these all singly packaged, or are they going onto a tray? So,
right.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me ask you, I know I kind of skipped ahead here, but in just the workflow from the clinic to your department, how are you transporting and or tracking, because I know there's not scanning at that stage, but how are you keeping track of what's coming in from who into decontam?
So the system we developed was they are transported to us in some large totes. Inside of the large tote, there is a red biohazard bin that is latched and locked and placed inside of a plastic bag. Then there is a request sheet or form that essentially, I look at it sometimes as a pick list, that they write out what they're sending to us or what they're requiring back. And then inside the red bin, there is a plastic basket. I call them the basket. So on these baskets, we developed a basket scan. So a barcode that just states the location with some acronyms and which number of basket it is. Because most locations that we have, we try to keep it track of the amount of baskets they should have for those instrumentation. So on that barcode is the scan for our decontam scan. So it shows that it reached our decontamination at that time on the day. So it's kind of a vague bring it in just saying, hey, these are from Clinic X and they were received on this day. And then if inside of that basket there are trays with those barcodes I mentioned, then we scan those barcodes. So then we know it's physically on our location on the day and how many of the baskets for those locations. Items then are treated in those baskets to stay like it's a surgical tray. Those instruments don't just get put half in another tray, half in another, to lose track of it. You keep them all, you clean them, you keep them all in the basket. And then they are also every barcode then gets scanned again to whether it's a sync scan or if you're doing sonic scanning or then to washer scan. And they're all kept separate from any other things that are going on in decontam. And the other way we also learned from our first clinics we took on, and then we gained even more a few years later, that having the technician who is going to be assembling those is the technician that's in decontam. Because we have had so many miscommunication of, are you sure that there was that mosquito in that basket? Because I can't find it is in the bottom of the Sonic. So if the person who maybe doesn't memorize the sheet of what it says that's being sent in, because it could be 50 items from the eye clinic, you're not going to stand there and check 50 items right then and there. But at least you have your eye on it. You're checking your Sonic. If you're using the Sonic, you're checking the bottom of your sink. You're verifying those items go all onto the same washer rack or 2 of them, so you can keep an eye on them, push those into the washer, and then as it goes through the wash process, it gets to the clean side. That same individual then is offloading and then taking it to their workstation to begin going through those sheets and verifying what they say they sent is actually what they sent. Because a lot of times that's a discrepancy as well.
On just the challenge piece, like I know we talked about, some of this, but that workflow, because you've alluded to, you've already learned through the process, sometimes the hard way. But what are some other challenges or, things that you've learned along the way that if you were to do this differently, like onboard a clinic today, like what would you do different today in onboarding a clinic than maybe 5 years ago when you began the process?
I'd go on site and do inventory. And that has been a huge regret that I have for the first 10, 12 that we took on in 2017. They, I believe, were supposed to have done some sort of an inventory, tell us what they have. Again, the differences of what you call just a scissor or a forceps or a pickup is completely different from what truly is on site. And also, again, back to the, was it one-time use that they've been using many times? Or is it something that's just back in a closet that we sometimes use, but don't worry, you probably won't see it. Inventory your instrumentation that is going to come to you, because that will solve the problems of missing items and what did you start with. And you're going to have one location, maybe like I did, who was so organized. They had somebody who was just a champion just because they just put themselves out there, and they had everything so well organized in each cupboard and each procedure room and knew really well what they had because they also were the big part of ordering instrumentation. And then you have another that they have no idea what they have. So inventory is the very first thing at the location. While doing that, you then get a chance to meet the manager, the supervisor, or the champions of sterile processing. Maybe it was someone who actually used to run the tabletop autoclave and was like, I know how to do this, and this is what we did. Meet those people. And then after that, you have a better grounds for knowing what's coming your way, and also recommendation as to what maybe they need to order. And also, like I said, get rid of some of that instrumentation that's just lower grade and explain to them why. After that, then you're just on to, I guess, pretty much the routine that we've been doing has been working, I guess. The idea I had before reality hit was to actually code each instrument with a tracking dot. And then I saw what was coming, and then I decided not to do that right away. I'd love to be able to in the future, but that's where you get your basket scans and you take in what you can as you're coming into clinics, coming to Central. You have to do it in baby steps sometimes before you can run away with it.
You're really teeing up the final question here very well, but I think relationships is a big part of what you said. You just didn't say it straight out, but going and taking inventory and being present and creating those relationships will alert you to turnover. It'll help you educate proactively. It will help you manage the whole process, keep it smooth, and not only for the clinics, but for the department as well, because you'll prevent some of the he said, she said, because as soon as there is turnover, maintaining that system and that process you have for working with a remote. And really that's the issue, is that they're remote. They're not somebody that you're necessarily going to come face to face with every single day. So when there's conflict, you have an easy opportunity to try to clear that up and keep moving. That's so critical. But I guess the last thing I want to ask you is, technology always helps with some of these things, helps us be really clear. So maybe some innovation ideas that you would have for improving the management of clinic instruments and tracking it, and maybe even communicating with them when you can't be face to face.
Well, I mentioned, dotting each individual instrument, which is valuable, and that technology is out there to be able to scan those dots, the QR codes, to show where those instruments are. But I think what would be valuable would be something where it's an RFID tag that you're able to actually look on a system to see where those items are, because they may be in a disposable bin on location. And some of that he said, she said could also happen as well, where I know we didn't leave it in our Sonic, or we don't have it just laying around somewhere, because that can often be what the accusation can be, is, can you just look one more time? It might still be there. And having that technology would be really, really valuable to be able to really see physically where that item may have gotten misplaced and set somewhere where someone packaged it already and meant to grab it. So it could be SPD, or it could be something that wrapped up in a drape and got thrown away, or a patient walked off with it. That would be a cool and innovative idea for instrument tracking.
All right, Angela, really nice job on this interview. And I got to tell you, you sound like you're happy and you enjoy your job. And I can tell you there's a lot of people out there that look at the clinic management and it's like pulling their hair out. And so I just want to encourage them. If you're out there and you don't have a good process, it can be done. And I know, Angela, you're all over social media and LinkedIn. And so I'm sure they could always do like an in-mail message to you. And then also, not only is it doable, but if all of a sudden you get warned that it's coming down the pike, you can and will be happy if you put some effort into putting the right structure in there. So thanks so much for sharing the insight today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
That was Angela Benson, Sterile Processing Education Specialist at UW Health. And Hank, you kind of said it towards the end there. The clinic piece it's a difficult nut to crack. And I remember the last time we talked about this, I think we're going all the way back to season 1.
I was thinking about that.
Who was it? Who was it?
Don Williams. Yeah.
Don Williams. Mm-hmm. That's right. And he's since moved on from that role, but he managed a large number of clinics. To a tracking company, right. So there you go. The irony of pulling the old episode and guests together. Yeah. Actually, that probably is why. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity here. The opportunity for communication breakdown is just so huge. I've seen forms, etc., but I just think Angela nailed it right there towards, the middle of the end, talking about getting out in front of the sites, having some communication, staying on top of turnover. It's really the relationships that makes this successful. The finger pointing is so easy when there's no relationship involved, and the distance from clinic to centralized reprocessing is too great.
I mean, I'm not surprised, Justin, that you were drawn to that part, because you're the people person. I'm the process person. And I was drawn to, 100% of their clinics do not have any internal tracking. And I've been thinking the whole interview, oh man, how crazy and difficult is that? We've got this very important link or links in the chain that there's zero transparency. Yeah, we can start tracking once they get to our departments and through our whole process, and it's critical and important, just like we wrapped up. All those records need to be kept. However, I'm sitting here thinking okay, there is still a massive gap, and there's got to be some kind of technology solution that is scalable into these clinics, because they don't have any money to spend on a full-scale tracking system. And honestly, they probably don't need one, but how can we bridge that in a cost-efficient and practical way? And I'm not smart enough to get that answer, but maybe someone who's tuning in is.
That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application. We also have bonus content only for certain episodes, and you got to download the smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there, we'd really appreciate a rating and a review on the app, because your feedback is important to the show. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email on over to info@beyondclean.net. And on behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.